Thank you, Cappy. A child of war. I was 4 years old when the war began in 1939. My family consisted of my father, mother, and two brothers, 7 and 9 years older than myself, and my 81-year-old grandmother. We lived in a new, modern co-op apartment building complex. At the end of our street was a lovely park with a big fountain and pool. Although we lived in the Ruhr Valley, the heart of the country's largest coal and steel producing industrial area, the few memories I have of that brief pre-war period included family outings to clear lakes and green mountains and good times with my playmates, and we were happy. My father had been 17 years old when he volunteered in World War I, spending his last 2 years of that war in the trenches at the Somme, where he lost half a lung to poison gas and suffered from shrapnel wandering forever through his body. After the war, he became a teacher and school principal, but he was a mandatory member of the reserve and had to spend every August on maneuvers, usually in East Prussia. In 1939, at age 42, he did not return from there, but was instead transferred to the regular army and participated in the invasion of Poland. He was severely wounded in France in 1942. When he was finally discharged from various hospitals in the summer of 43, he was left with both physical and psychological wounds from which he would never recover. My oldest brother was attending school on an academic track intended to prepare boys to take the entrance exam for university. My younger brother had been picked in 1938 to attend an elite boarding school established by the Nazi Party for boys and girls with high academic, athletic, and leadership potential. He was shipped off to his school in a castle outside Cologne at age 10. My mother strongly objected to sending away her young son, but no one so honored, in quotes, would dare refuse an offer of a free, first-rate classical education. We only saw him occasionally on brief vacations, but he seemed to be happy. Based on what he told us about his life at school, I became determined to become a candidate in third grade for one of the girls' schools. But of course, that never came to pass. The concept of war was incomprehensible to a 4-year-old, but when it began, it seemed to involve the disappearance of a lot of fathers and brothers, including my own, and older sisters and household help who suddenly had to start working in factories. Basement spaces in each residential building were converted to bomb shelters. We were all issued gas masks, horrible claustrophobic things, practiced air raid drills, made blackout curtains for every window, put little round reflecting discs on our coats at night since there were no more streetlights, kept our small bags with emergency clothes and food handy, and got used to rationing coupons for just about everything. Unfortunately for us, we lived only about 10 kilometers from the Krupp factories, which produced the bulk of the war materiel for the German armies. This meant that while it took a couple of years or more for the air war to affect the rest of the country, we were a priority target from the beginning. After sporadic raids the first year, the pace picked up to the point where the sirens would sound just about every night, except Sundays. Every night we listened to the radio announce the approach of enemy planes, their numbers, directions, and expected targets, trying to decide whether it was worth going to bed before they arrived. Sometimes we slept in our clothes, but I vividly remember the struggle of being roused from a deep sleep and having to fight my way into my clothes, often getting things on in the wrong order or on the wrong limb, while my mother dressed my grandmother, who had broken her hip and was quite handicapped. With the help of the elderly air raid warden, each building had one, we would move from the second floor to the basement shelter. I brought a box with letters of the alphabet and later books with me and pretty much taught myself to read during those long hours in the shelter. As the raids increased in duration and ferocity, we learned to distinguish the various sounds, the bombs whose screeching and whistling we could hear on their way down, enabling us to judge how far away they were landing. We learned that it was those you didn't hear that were likely to kill you. I started school in the summer of 1941. Each student was required to carry a cigar box for collecting the metal splinters left by the previous night's raid and turn them in at school so they could be recycled into new weapons. When the United States entered the war, the raids were conducted during the day, adding to the RAF raids at night. I remember watching as vast formations of hundreds of planes passed overhead. Some images from this period have been seared into my memory. Seeing and feeling the flames of the buildings on both sides of our street meet overhead in a fiery arch was a sight both terrifying and awe-inspiring with a certain terrible beauty. Getting used to the sight of dead bodies, I saw more dead people as a child than most people will see in a lifetime. Shrunken bodies of neighbors being carried out of burning buildings. After one raid, bodies in broken, scattered coffins that had been awaiting burial outside a Catholic church across from my kindergarten. In 1943, my oldest brother, then 17, along with everyone else in his class, was assigned to an anti-aircraft battery where they spent their nights going to school during the day. The next year, my other brother, age 16, joined him at the battery. My own education was seriously disrupted because we spent half of every school day huddled in the shelter. By late summer of 43, our building had been hit twice by phosphorus bombs, taking out the roof, attic, and third floor, leaving our apartment on the second floor next in line. My job when the building was hit was to open a series of doors ahead of the old men and the women who were carrying out buckets of burning debris after the all clear. By now, a number of buildings in the immediate neighborhood had been totally destroyed. The house across from ours collapsed on top of the 30 people in that shelter whose bodies were never recovered. One of them was my oldest brother's girlfriend. He decided that was enough. We had to leave. He contacted a second cousin who had a farm about 125 kilometers away and was told that there were a couple of rooms in an old farmhouse we could use. At age 8, I was sent ahead of the rest of my family on a train that made frequent stops to let people out to hit the ground when the low-flying fighter planes appeared. A relative met me at the station, and I finished the last 13 kilometers of the trip on borrowed bicycles. At last, I had a respite from night raids and enough to eat. But I also immediately became a member of the farm's reduced workforce. As a city kid without any knowledge of farm life, I had to learn in a hurry. But I did and acquired some skills I still use today. I also started going to the two-room school in the next village in the mornings and made friends with children from the neighboring farms. Whenever we could, we would play the usual childhood games and some new war games we invented. One of the women farm workers who lived in an attic room next to mine was put in charge of me for the 4 months I was there by myself. I thought I had adjusted well to my new conditions, but I must have been much more homesick and worried than I knew, because after a couple of months, I started wetting the bed. There was no toilet in the attic, and the doors to the family quarters downstairs were locked at night. So I had to go down the stairs in the pitch dark, feel my way through the stables that took up 2/3 of the house to pee in the straw. If I didn't wake up in time, I learned that I could dry the sheets by rubbing them for several hours. But of course, that didn't fool my assigned caretaker who gave me hell every time. I think she was one of the few people I really learned to hate. The condition persisted until I was 12, and I realized writing this that I've never told anyone except my immediate family about this problem. Finally, my parents and grandmother arrived, and I moved from my attic room to the old farmhouse. My father had managed to transport a few household items like the kitchen stove, a stove for heating our living room, some beds and bedding, kitchen stuff, and of all things, our piano. Within a few days of leaving the city, the rest of our building was destroyed by an air raid that no one would have survived. In our new home, there was no electricity, no heat except for the stove, not even a sink, just an outhouse and a well 30 yards from the house. Within the next few months, our ranks unexpectedly swelled to a total of 12, with my mother's older sisters, their husbands, and grown children. But we managed somehow with the 2 bedrooms, a small stone-floored room that would serve as the kitchen, and an additional small loft space. Everyone except my grandmother had to work on the farm in exchange for food. We gathered berries, beech nuts to be boiled for oil, and scrounged sugar beets to boil for molasses. We gathered fallen branches and dug up stumps in my uncle's woods for heat and cooking. The daytime bombing and strafing by now extended to all areas anywhere near target cities, which included us once again. My grandmother and 2 of the elderly relatives staying with us died from heart attacks or stroke, and there was no way to get them buried for days because of the constant attacks. I could not stand staying in the house during a raid and would escape to crawl under a hedge or a big tree in leaf, watching the markers and the aerial fights. Planes on both sides were shot down, exploded in the air, coming down in pieces. In one case, 2 Allied bombers were shot down practically on top of us, with pieces of the planes hitting the farmhouse. The plane had been too close to the ground for the parachutes of the 12 crew members to open. My 15-year-old cousin and I were ordered to collect the dog tags of the young airmen who had dropped all around us, their exposed skin looking like veined blotting paper, and their bodies shrunk to about my size from the impact. The bodies were buried in a mass grave in the local cemetery across from my grandmother's grave, and sometime after the war, exhumed by the British and returned to England. The 2 feet deep depressions of some of their outlines remained in the meadow just below our house for a long time. As the war drew to a close, other evacuees and a number of refugees from the eastern provinces arrived after harrowing treks ahead of the Russian army. Others came from nearby cities to barter whatever possessions they had left for food. The villagers did not take kindly to having us all foisted on them, and were not about to share their harvest with us for nothing. So every able-bodied person worked on the farms. It was my job to string sticky, smelly tobacco leaves on wires for drying, a job I hated. Tobacco had become valuable currency, but food was a more important product. We were all getting more gaunt by the day. My mother, who had weighed around 140 pounds before the war, was down to 95 pounds by the end of it. At that point, she suffered a nervous breakdown, which manifested itself over a period of several months in uncontrollable crying, almost howling jags, which scared the daylights out of me. But even then, we still found reasons to laugh, and the young people did their best to cheer everyone up. In August 1944, I started to attend a girls' school 10 kilometers away. I traveled by bicycle, but constantly had to drop my bike and dive into a ditch, the woods, a bomb crater, or at least lie prone on the ground or under a tree until the strafing planes were gone. So actual instructional time was much reduced. But it's where I began to learn English. However, all schools closed in October of 44 and did not reopen for over a year. Near the end of the war, my younger brother deserted from his position on the anti-aircraft battery and made his way to us by walking at night and holding up during the days. My father was very ill, so my brother became the leader of the farm menagerie, people and animals alike. It finally became apparent that the end was near. The remnants of the German army came through, shedding tattered uniforms and weapons. We'd been hearing artillery fire for days, and finally the rumble of tanks on the Autobahn about 5 kilometers away. In school, we'd been fed a lot of Nordic mythology, but little of the political, historical, and ethical background that had brought our country to this point. We had also been told to defend the fatherland at all costs. And at age 10, I was willing to give it a personal try. On April 20, Hitler's birthday, half a dozen other girls and I joined the junior girls version of the League of German Girls, the female equivalent of the boys' Hitler Youth. I'd heard for years from one of my cousins how much fun it was. The uniforms and activities were very similar to the Girl Scouts, and had been waiting impatiently to join the fun, even though part of me knew perfectly well that the end was in sight. But we'd taken the oath, so when a neighbor spotted the first American troops entering the village, I put on my secondhand uniform jacket, escaped my mother's eagle eye, went to town, and planted myself smack in the middle of the road, ready to defend at least my family. We'd been told on the radio for days that we'd be shot on sight by the enemy. Leading the troops was a very big black soldier in full camouflage with twigs all over his helmet on a motorcycle. An astonishing sight for someone who'd never even seen a black man before. To my dismay, he didn't even look at me, but went right around me and on up the road. No one else followed him for a while, so quite deflated, I retreated to the house and my mother's wrath. The following 2 years were quite possibly even worse than the war. The British occupation force had given the numerous Polish forced laborers trucks, uniforms, guns, and ammunition, and told them to go and do as they liked to the local population. They operated mostly at night, looting farms and sometimes randomly shooting the owners. One day they came during the afternoon and found a group of us digging potatoes in the field. They trained their guns on us and made us line up with our hands over our heads as they walked along the line, staring intently at each of us. They forced 2 boys and a 70-year-old farm manager onto the truck and took off. The boys returned on foot several days later, beaten, but not seriously injured. The farm manager was beaten so badly that he spent months in the hospital and never worked again. This period of local terror lasted 4 to 6 weeks. The near starvation, the millions left homeless, the small children and old people dying in record numbers, especially during several harsh winters, and every aspect of the infrastructure in tatters, stayed with us. But what finally really brought us to our knees was the disclosure of what had been done in the concentration camps. Learned through exhibits created by the occupation that all students were required to attend. It was too much to assimilate. We felt that the very ground had been pulled out from under us, and that there was little left to hold on to or believe in. My brother and I decided, that although we loved our parents and knew that they were not personally responsible for the immediate past, we could not look at them in the same way ever again. They were the generation responsible for putting a madman into position to perpetrate the crimes against humanity that had brought us to where we were. We threw ourselves into the country's rebuilding efforts and did our best to complete our education, a difficult task under the circumstances. We had no income for 4 years until my father was finally able to draw his disability pension. But in 1956, with the help of a building savings association, we were able to build the first new house in the village. My oldest brother, who had arrived at the farm in the summer of 47, after 2 years of working as a prisoner of war in the French coal mines, eventually emigrated to Canada, where he put himself through college and law school, married, became a lawyer for the provincial government of British Columbia, and ultimately was named Queen's Counsel. Whether by chance, sheer luck, or the hand of God, as some would say, our immediate family did survive. And there were many, many times when we believed we would not.